Part 1. The Shattered Foundation. The light in the 47th floor conference room was crystalline, a sterile, museum-quality glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was a light Ethan David had designed himself, calculated to fall perfectly on the centerpiece of the room, a scale model of the Elysian Tower. It was a symphony of acrylic, steel, and light. A miniature god of a building that would soon pierce the Boston skyline. Ethan circled it now, a predator admiring his kill, the soft hum of the city far below a testament to his dominion. "It's not just a building, you see," Ethan said, his voice smooth and resonant, polished by years of boardroom presentations and client dinners. He gestured toward the model, his hand tracing its impossible, elegant curve. Anyone can stack steel and glass. This is a statement. It's about aspiration. It's about legacy. The journalist, a young woman named Chloe with eager eyes and a digital recorder, scribbled furiously in her notepad. A legacy for the city, or for David and Thorne, she asked. Ethan allowed a small, practiced smile. He leaned against the vast mahogany table, the city of Boston sprawling out behind him through a floor-to-ceiling window. The firm is the vehicle. The vision, he tapped his own temple, is the engine. He didn't mention Marcus Thorne, his partner. Marcus was the numbers man, the handshaker, the politician. Necessary, certainly, but not the visionary. The Elysian was Ethan's soul rendered in concrete and rebar. "Your firm has had an unprecedented run of success," Chloe continued, glancing up from her notes. "What's the secret?" "There's no secret," Ethan replied, the smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "It's about refusing to compromise. It's about seeing what others can't and having the courage to build it. I've always believed that if you want something done right, you do it yourself. You push your team, you demand perfection, and you don't accept excuses." As if on cue, a junior architect, a young man named Peterson, with a perpetually worried expression, hovered at the doorway. He held a rolled-up blueprint like a holy scroll. "Mr. David, I have a question about the HVSE schematics for the sublevels." Ethan didn't turn his head. He flicked his wrist in a gesture of dismissal. "Figure it out, Peterson. That's what I pay you for." The young man flinched and retreated, the whisper of his retreating footsteps swallowed by the plush carpet. Ethan turned his attention back to Chloe. His charisma switched back on like a lamp. "Perfection," he repeated, as if there had been no interruption. His phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a picture of his wife, Sarah, smiling with their daughter, Lily on her shoulders. He silenced it with a swipe of his thumb. Sarah didn't understand. She saw the long hours, the missed dinners, the preoccupied silences. She didn't see the monument he was building for them, for their name. He'd call her back later, after the interview, after he had finished basking in the glow of his own creation. One last question. "Mr. David," Chloe said, clicking her pen. "When it's finished, when you stand at the base of the Elysian Tower and look up, what do you hope people will feel?" Ethan straightened up, walking to the window. He placed his hand on the cool glass, his reflection superimposed over the distant, skeletal frame of the real tower rising from the earth. "I hope they feel small," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I hope they feel awe." The interview concluded with handshakes and more practiced smiles. Chloe and her photographer packed up, leaving Ethan alone in the silent room. He stood there for a long time, watching the construction cranes move like deliberate insects on his masterpiece. The sense of triumph was a physical thing, a warmth that spread through his chest. It was the feeling of being right, of being vindicated, of being, in his own world, infallible. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered it. It wasn't Sarah. It was the site foreman, a man named Henderson, whose voice was usually a low, gravelly rumble. Today was a high-pitched, panicked crackle. "Ethan, my God. Ethan, you need to get down here. Now." "What is it?" "Henderson, a supply issue," Ethan asked, annoyed at the interruption to his reverie. No. It's... A structural report just came in from the city engineers. There's a vibration, a harmonic resonance in the western load-bearing columns. The ones from the revised spec, the ones Marcus signed off on. Ethan's blood went cold. The warmth in his chest vanished, replaced by a knot of ice. "What are you talking about?" "Those were triple-checked. They're saying there was a miscalculation in the tensile strength of the alloy, a catastrophic one. Ethan, there was a cascade failure. The northwest corner, floors 34 to 40. It's pancaked. There's been a partial collapse." Ethan couldn't breathe. He stumbled back from the window, his eyes fixed on the distant crane, which had frozen in midair. He looked at the perfect, gleaming model on the table. His acrylic legacy. It was pristine, whole. A lie. "Evacuate the site." Ethan managed to choke out, his voice a strangled rasp. "We're trying, it's chaos. The news crews are already here." Ethan dropped the phone. It clattered onto the mahogany table, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, crushing silence. His own phone, sitting next to it, began to vibrate uncontrollably, a frantic, screaming buzz as alerts, texts, and calls began to pour in. The world was cracking. He could hear the sound of sirens now, not the distant, ignorable hum of the city, but a rising, piercing wail that was coming for him. He stared at the model of his glass tower, and in its flawless, reflective surface, he saw the foundation of his entire life shatter into a million pieces. The conference room felt less like a sanctuary now and more like a cage. The sterile air was suffocating. The calculated light, a harsh, unforgiving glare. The days that followed were a blur of halogen-lit rooms and the rustle of paper that carried the weight of ruin. In a law office that smelled of lemon polish and quiet desperation, Ethan sat beside a grim-faced attorney named Wallace, while another team of lawyers, representing what was once David and Thorne architecture, laid out the catastrophe in cold, numerical terms. The preliminary investigation points to a critical flaw in the metallurgical composition of the support beams for the upper western quadrant. One of the opposing lawyers droned, his voice devoid of any emotion. The specifications were altered mid-construction to a cheaper supplier. The change order was signed. He paused, sliding a document across the polished table. "By you, Mr. David." Ethan stared at the paper. It was his signature, a confident, arrogant scrawl. He remembered the day vaguely. Marcus had rushed into his office, a stack of papers in his hand. Just a few supply chain adjustments. "Ethan, standard stuff. Saves us nearly 8 figures. I vetted them." Ethan had been on a call, sketching a modification for the tower's spire. He'd waved Marcus off, scribbled his name without looking, eager to get back to the real work. The vision. Marcus vouched for the supplier. Ethan said, his own voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. He handled that entire side of the business. Mr. Thorne's legal representatives have provided documentation showing he raised concerns about the supplier's testing protocols. The lawyer continued smoothly. He claims he brought these concerns to you, and you insisted on pushing forward to maintain the construction schedule and budget. He has an email, a fabrication, a complete and utter lie. A dagger forged by his best friend and slid neatly between his ribs. That's impossible, Ethan whispered. Wallace, his own lawyer, put a heavy hand on his shoulder. Ethan, we can fight this, but they've built a narrative. The narrative was swift and brutal. The firm of David and Thorne was dissolved in a matter of days. Its assets frozen to cover the initial wave of lawsuits. The Elysian Tower, once a symbol of his ambition, was now a mangled wreck on every news channel, a monument to his failure. The media, which had once lauded him as a genius, now painted him as a charlatan, a man whose hubris had endangered hundreds and cost billions. They ran photos of him from the magazine interview, his smug smile now looking like the face of criminal negligence. The fall from grace was an avalanche. But the true collapse happened within the walls of his own home. Their Boston apartment, a cold, minimalist space he had once thought of as chic and modern, now felt like a mausoleum. The clean lines and stark white walls offered no comfort, only echoes. How could you not tell me Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding her body together? Her face, usually so open and warm, was a mask of fear and betrayal. The money. Ethan, they say we're going to lose everything. It's not about the money. Sarah, he shot back, pacing like a caged animal. It's about my name, my work. Marcus, he set me up. He threw me to the wolves to save himself. He's your partner, your best friend since college. Why would he do that? Because he's a leech. He always has been. He rode my coattails, my talent. And the second things got rough, he cut the rope. Ethan's voice was raw with a fury that was his only defense against the crushing weight of despair. Or maybe you were so wrapped up in your own vision that you stopped paying attention to anything else. Sarah's voice cracked, and the anger gave way to a wave of pain. To the details, to the firm, to me. That was the blow that struck home, the one that hurt more than the betrayal of Marcus or the scorn of the public. He saw it then, not as a lack of faith in him, but as the stark truth. He had treated her like he treated Peterson, the junior architect, a necessary but secondary part of his world. I did this for us, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. For Lily, to build a legacy. We had a life. Ethan, she said, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. Not a legacy, a life. And you were barely in it. Now what do we have? He had no answer. He stood there, in the wreckage of his career and his marriage, and felt a profound, terrifying isolation. He was betrayed by the man he called his brother and completely, utterly misunderstood by the woman he loved. The anger was a shield, but beneath it, a chasm of fear was opening up. He had built his entire identity on the foundation of his success. Now that it was gone, he was nothing. He was a ghost haunting the halls of a life that no longer belonged to him. The drive from Boston to Havenwood, Vermont, was a funeral procession for a life they were leaving behind. Ethan drove in a stony silence, the sleek German sedan, one of the last vestiges of their former wealth. Feeling alien and ostentatious on the winding, tree-lined roads of the countryside. In the passenger seat, Sarah stared out the window, her face pale. In the back, 7-year-old Lily was a small, confused bundle of questions. Is our new house bigger than our apartment? Daddy, yes. Lily, Ethan answered, his voice flat. Does it have a TV? I don't know. Why are we moving? Because we are. He snapped, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Sarah shot him a pained look, then turned around. It's an adventure, sweetie. We're going to live in the house where Grandpa and Great-Grandpa grew up. Her voice was bright, but it was a fragile, brittle thing. The David ancestral home was less a house and more a monument to decay. It loomed at the end of a gravel driveway, a large 3-story Victorian that had once been grand, with intricate gingerbread trim and a wide, welcoming porch. Now, the paint was peeling in long, leprous strips. The porch sagged on one side, and several windows were boarded up. The surrounding yard was a riot of overgrown weeds and skeletal, grasping trees. It was the physical manifestation of Ethan's soul. Lily's face fell. It looks spooky. It just needs a little love, that's all, Sarah said, her forced optimism already beginning to fray. They were bankrupt, publicly shamed. The Boston apartment, the cars, the savings all liquidated or seized to pay the mounting legal fees. This house, inherited from his father and ignored for 2 decades, was all they had left. Ethan had always considered it a worthless relic, a millstone of property taxes and bad memories of stilted holiday visits as a child. Now, it was their only refuge, their exile. The inside was worse. It smelled of dust, mildew, and the ghosts of a better past. Every surface was coated in a fine gray film. Furniture huddled under yellowed sheets like shrouded corpses. Sarah, true to her nature, immediately began to try. She pulled a sheet off a sofa, sending a cloud of dust motes dancing in the weak afternoon light. Well, she declared with a cough, at least it has good bones. But Ethan saw only the rot. He saw the water stains on the ceiling, the cracked plaster on the walls, the faded wallpaper peeling back to reveal the dark, crumbling lath beneath. This house was a tomb, and he was being buried alive in it. While Sarah set about creating a habitable corner for Lily in one of the less daunting bedrooms, Ethan retreated. He found his way to a room at the back of the house, a study his father and grandfather had once used. It was lined with dark, imposing bookshelves filled with decaying leather-bound volumes. A massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface scarred with a history of forgotten work. He sank into the cracked leather armchair behind it, the cool, musty air a welcome balm to his raw nerves. He didn't help unpack. He didn't offer a word of comfort or encouragement. He was consumed by a bitter, silent rage that was too vast and too deep for words. He stared out the grimy window at the tangled woods behind the house, a wilderness as impenetrable as his own future. He had reached the summit of his world, only to be hurled from its peak into this forgotten, decomposing pit. This wasn't a temporary setback. This wasn't a challenge to be overcome. This was rock bottom, a place of total, suffocating hopelessness. And he had dragged his family down here with him. He closed his eyes and let the silence of the dusty room swallow him whole. Part 2. Whispers from the dust. The days bled into one another. a monotonous gray river of despair. Morning light would filter through the study's grimy panes, and Ethan would still be there, slumped in the old armchair, an empty whiskey bottle often standing sentinel on the floor beside him. He avoided Sarah and Lily. The sound of their voices, Sarah's forced cheerfulness, Lily's innocent laughter like shards of glass in his ears. They were a reminder of the life he had broken, the people he had failed. The study became his fortress and his prison, its dusty silence a shield against a world he no longer had the strength to face. His rage had cooled into a hard, dense resentment that sat in his gut like a stone. He resented the house for its decay, Sarah for her resilience, Marcus for his treachery, and the world for its judgment. Most of all, he resented his own powerlessness. He, Ethan David, the master builder, the visionary, could not fix this. One afternoon, a week into their exile, a new kind of desperation took hold. It was a practical, ugly need. They were running out of money, the last of their liquidated cash dwindling with every trip Sarah made to the small-town grocery store. Fueled by a mix of cheap whiskey and self-loathing, he began to search the study, not for solace, but for something of value. He ran his hands over the spines of the old books, looking for a rare first edition. He tapped the wood-paneled walls, searching for a hidden safe. Nothing. His attention fell to the massive oak desk. It was a fortress of a thing, solid and immovable. He pulled at its drawers. Most were empty, save for dried-up inkwells and rusted paperclips. But the wide, central drawer was locked. He rattled it, a flicker of something hope-greed sparking in his chest. It had to hold something. Old stock certificates, a forgotten bank book, a stash of heirloom jewelry. He found a rusty letter opener and began to pry at the lock. The old wood groaned in protest. He worked at it with a feverish intensity. The simple, physical task, a welcome distraction from the maelstrom in his head. Wood splintered. The lock gave way with a sharp crack. He yanked the drawer open, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, there was no money, no treasure. There was only a single object, nestled in the center of the drawer as if placed there with great care. It was a Bible, large, heavy, bound in dark brown leather that was cracked and worn smooth with age. The gilt on the page edges had long since faded to a dull, coppery brown. A wave of disgust washed over him. A Bible, a book of fairy tales and empty platitudes. He reached in, his intention to hurl it into the empty fireplace, to watch its useless pages turn to ash. It was the perfect symbol of his fruitless search, an offer of hollow comfort where he needed cold. Hard cash. But as his fingers closed around the leather cover, he paused. It was the weight of it, the sheer physical substance of the object. It felt ancient, solid, real. It felt heavier than it should, as if it held more than just paper and ink within its covers. He lifted it from the drawer. The leather was cool and supple under his hands. For a reason he could not name, he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Instead, he dropped it onto the dusty surface of the desk, where it landed with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room. Sleep was a shallow, restless sea that Ethan could not drown in. He would drift for an hour or two, only to be jerked awake by nightmares of falling steel and the phantom ring of his phone. In the dead of night, the old house groaned around him, the wind whispering through the eaves like accusations. This night was no different. He sat in the dark study, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows through the window, the dregs of whiskey warm in his glass. His gaze fell upon the heavy Bible lying on the desk. He had no intention of reading it. Religion was a crutch for the weak, a system of rules for those who lacked their own moral compass. He had built his world without God, and he would face its ruin without him, too. But the silence of the house was immense, and his own thoughts were unbearable company. Idly, resentfully, he reached out and pulled the book toward him. He opened the heavy cover. On the first flyleaf, written in an elegant, faded cursive script, was a name and a date. Daniel David, 1929. His great-grandfather, the man who had built this house. Ethan felt a faint, almost non-existent flicker of interest. He turned the brittle, onion skin pages, the paper whispering under his touch. And then he saw it. The margins were filled with writing. The same elegant, disciplined hand had filled nearly every available space with notes, thoughts, and prayers. It was a diary written in the white space of Scripture. He let the book fall open at random. It landed somewhere in the Old Testament, in the book of Job. A passage was heavily underlined in faded ink, the lines precise and straight, drawn with a ruler. Job 121, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Ethan snorted. Easy words to say for someone who hadn't just lost everything. But then he saw the notes scrawled in the margin next to the verse. The ink was slightly darker here, the handwriting a little less steady, as if written under great strain. October 30th, 1929. The factory's gone. My name is mud in this town. All seems lost. But is all truly lost the Lord gave? The mill, the accounts, the good name. He has taken them away. Dare I still bless his name? I must... Ethan froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He read the note again, and a third time. October 30th, 1929. The day after Black Tuesday, the great crash. The year the world's economy had imploded, taking fortunes and lives with it. The factory is gone. My name is mud in this town. A chill, entirely unrelated to the late-night air, crept up Ethan's spine. He looked at the words of a man dead for half a century, a man he had never known, and felt a sudden, shocking kinship. The language was different, the century was different, but the sentiment was identical. The shame, the public ruin, the totality of the loss. For the first time since the phone call from Henderson, Ethan felt something other than rage or despair. It was a strange, unsettling connection, a whisper from the dust that sounded unnervingly like his own voice. The first crack in the wall of his cynicism had appeared, thin as a hairline, but there all the same. The flicker of interest ignited into a low, burning obsession. For the first time in weeks, Ethan had a purpose. It wasn't about rebuilding his firm or clearing his name. It was about deciphering the story of this ghost, Daniel David. Each morning, instead of reaching for the bottle, he reached for the heavy Bible. He sat at the great oak desk for hours, a pot of coffee at his elbow, meticulously turning the fragile pages. The notes were a map of a man's soul navigating a storm. They were chronological, a trail of breadcrumbs leading Ethan through a landscape of ruin that was hauntingly familiar. In the margin of a psalm about enemies gloating, Daniel had written "saw hemlock at the market today." He would not meet my eye. The man who clapped my back at the club last year now crosses the street to avoid me. Ethan felt a flash of his own experience, of former colleagues whose calls now went straight to voicemail. He found a cluster of notes in the book of Nehemiah, the story of a man rebuilding the broken walls of Jerusalem. Daniel's handwriting here was firm, resolute. November 1929. The ruin is great, but the foundation remains. I must rebuild, not with brick and mortar, but with faith and fortitude. One stone at a time. The parallels were undeniable, but Ethan, the architect, needed blueprints. He needed facts. Was this just the flowery, sanctimonious diary of a religious man? Or was it a true account driven by this new need for proof? He left the dusty sanctuary of the study. He showered, shaved, and put on clean clothes, an act that felt monumental. Sarah watched him from the kitchen doorway, her expression a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. But she said nothing, not wanting to break the spell. He drove the sedan into the small, sleepy town of Havenwood. The town square was a postcard of New England charm, a white-steepled church, a general store, and a small, red brick building with the words Havenwood Public Library etched above the door. Inside, the library smelled of old paper and floor wax. An elderly librarian with kind eyes and a cardigan looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" "Dear, I'm looking for old town records," Ethan said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Newspapers, specifically. From around 1929, 1930. Researching your family, are you?" she asked with a knowing smile. "You must be one of the Davids, up at the old house. You have your great-grandfather's eyes." The comment startled him, but he simply nodded. She led him to a clunky, beige microfilm machine in a corner and showed him how to thread the spools of film. For the next 2 hours, Ethan scrolled through the crackling black and white pages of the Havenwood Chronicle. And there it was. The headlines told the story in stark, unforgiving print. David Textile Mill declares bankruptcy. Dozens out of work. Local magnate Daniel David accused of mismanagement. Town faces economic hardship in wake of mill closure. There were articles detailing the town's anger and Daniel's public disgrace. It was a mirror image of his own headlines, written in a different font but with the same ink of accusation and shame. He sat back in the creaking library chair, the ghostly images flickering on the screen. The story in the Bible wasn't just a spiritual metaphor. It was real. His great-grandfather had stood exactly where Ethan was standing, now ruined, shamed, and blamed for the economic suffering of others. The eerie sense of connection solidified into a concrete, undeniable realization. His unique world-ending tragedy was not unique at all. 100 years ago, another man with his name in his blood had walked this same desolate path. The thought was not comforting, but it was grounding. For the first time, he felt he was not entirely alone in his own personal hell. The change in Ethan was subtle but palpable. The dark cloud of his silent rage began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He still spent his days in the study, but now it was a place of research, not retreat. Sarah noticed. She saw him hunched over the old Bible, not with a bottle, but with a notepad. She saw the light of intellectual curiosity in his eyes, a glimmer of the man she had married. One Sunday morning, as the sound of distant church bells drifted through the open kitchen window, she decided to take a risk. I was thinking of taking Lily to the church service this morning, she said casually, buttering a piece of toast, just to get out of the house, see some other faces. She paused, then added, "It might be good for her." The old Ethan would have scoffed. But the man who had spent a week communing with the ghost of his ancestor hesitated. He thought of Daniel, whose faith seemed to be the only thing that had survived his ruin. He thought of the white steepled church in the town square. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Okay, we'll go." The Havenwood Community Church was simple and bright, with plain wooden pews and clear glass windows that let the morning sun stream in. It was nothing like the cavernous, Gothic cathedrals he had occasionally visited for architectural inspiration. The people were friendly, offering quiet smiles and nods that were welcoming but not intrusive. The pastor, a man in his late 50s named Michael Reeves, had a gentle demeanor and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, unhurried wisdom. His sermon was less a lecture and more a conversation, a simple reflection on finding strength in times of trial. Ethan found himself listening, not with cynicism, but with a detached curiosity. After the service, as people milled around with coffee and donuts, Pastor Michael approached them. "Welcome," he said with a warm smile. "I'm Michael Reeves. I'm so glad you could join us. Ethan, David, this is my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily." "The David family," the pastor said, his smile widening. "It's good to have you back in Havenwood." There was no judgment in his voice, no hint that he knew of the scandal that had driven them there. Later that week, acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, Ethan found himself back at the church. He found Pastor Michael in his office, a room as cluttered and comfortable as the study in his own house. "Pastor," Ethan began, feeling awkward and out of place. I found this." He pulled a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to him. On it, he had transcribed one of Daniel's notes, written next to a passage in the book of James about counting trials as joy. Daniel's note read, "Joy is not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of God within it." "A lesson I am learning hourly," Pastor Michael read the note, then looked at Ethan. He didn't offer a theological interpretation or a pat answer. Instead, he asked a simple question. "What do you think Daniel was feeling when he wrote that the question disarmed Ethan?" He had been analyzing the words, not the man. "I think he was desperate," Ethan admitted, trying to convince himself, trying to find a logic for his suffering. "Perhaps," the pastor said, nodding slowly, "or perhaps he had found something." "What do you feel when you read it?" Ethan had no answer. But the conversation felt different from any he had ever had. It wasn't a debate to be won or a problem to be solved. It was an opening, a small door cracking open in the fortified walls of his mind. That evening, for the first time since their arrival in Havenwood, Ethan initiated a real conversation with Sarah. He brought the old Bible into the kitchen where she was washing dishes and opened it on the table. "Look at this," he said, his voice free of its usual angry edge. He showed her Daniel's name, the date, the spidery handwriting in the margins. He told her about the factory, the bankruptcy, the newspaper articles in the library. He spoke not with anger or self-pity, but with a bewildered sense of wonder. Sarah dried her hands and sat down opposite him, her eyes wide. She listened, truly listened, as he pieced together the story of his great-grandfather. As he spoke, the chasm that had opened up between them in their cold Boston apartment began to feel a little smaller. He was sharing something with her. Not a burden, but a mystery. A fragile seed of dialogue had been planted in the barren ground of their shared despair. The obsession deepened. Ethan felt he was on the verge of understanding the core of his great-grandfather's journey. He was a detective, and Daniel's soul was the crime scene. He delved deeper into the chronological notes, tracing the path from 1929 into the bleak heart of the Great Depression. He found a section written in the spring of 1930. The notes clustered around passages in the book of Proverbs cautioning against false friends and untrustworthy partners. One note, scribbled next to a verse about a companion who speaks peace to his neighbor, but mischief is in his heart, was sharp and angry. He swore on his mother's grave. We were in it together. A lie. The auditors found the second ledger. The funds were gone long before the crash. He used the market as a cover for his own thievery. Ethan's blood ran cold. He read the words again, his heart pounding. Betrayal. It wasn't just the market. Daniel's ruin, like his own, had been engineered by the man he trusted most. A partner who had embezzled funds and then, when the crash came, had pointed the finger of blame squarely at Daniel to save himself. A wave of cold, clarifying fury washed over Ethan. It was a righteous anger, not just for himself, but for this man, his ancestor. The perfect, chilling parallel of their stories was complete. Marcus and this nameless, faceless partner from a century ago were the same man, the same serpent. Ethan felt a bond with Daniel that was stronger than blood. It was a bond of shared wounding, of a specific and heinous betrayal. He felt vindicated in his own hatred for Marcus. It wasn't just petty bitterness, it was justice. His anger was righteous. He kept reading, eager to find Daniel's notes on vengeance, on seeing his enemy brought low. He searched for years through the notes, finding entries about hardship, prayer, and slow, painstaking rebuilding of a life. And then he found it. A final note on the topic of the betrayal. It was written much later, perhaps a decade or more. The ink faded, the handwriting calmer, more fluid. It was placed next to a passage in Colossians, a verse Ethan had to read several times to understand its meaning. Colossians 3:13, forbearing one another and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. Daniel's note was short, but it struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow. The bitterness was a heavier chain than the poverty. Freedom was not in justice, but in forgiveness. I have prayed for his soul. Ethan stared at the words, his mind recoiling. Forgiveness. The idea was repugnant, an absolute, unequivocal surrender. Forgive Marcus, the man who had methodically dismantled his life, stolen his legacy, and left him and his family in ruins. To forgive him would be to say that what he did was acceptable. It would be to validate the treachery, to absorb the injustice and call it peace. It was weak. It was pathetic. It was impossible. He slammed the ancient Bible shut, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the silent study. The connection he had felt with Daniel, the bond of shared suffering, was severed. His great-grandfather, at the final and most crucial juncture, had taken a path that Ethan could not, would not follow. He had come to the great obstacle of his journey. a mountain of scripture and scrawled ink that commanded him to do the one thing his entire being screamed was unthinkable. Never. Part 3. The Crucible of Forgiveness. The word echoed in the chambers of Ethan's mind, forgiveness. It was not a gentle whisper of grace. It was a dissonant, clanging command. The peace he had begun to feel in Havenwood evaporated, replaced by a churning, internal war. Daniel's final entry on the matter was a betrayal of their shared experience, a refutation of the righteous anger that had become Ethan's shield. He retreated from the Bible, from the study. He walked for hours in the dense, tangled woods behind the house, the damp earth clinging to his boots. He argued with the ghost of his great-grandfather. "You were a fool, old man," he muttered to the trees. "You let him win. Justice is what matters. Making them pay. That's freedom." But the words felt hollow, even to him. His hatred for Marcus was a living thing inside him, a toxic presence that soured his sleep and poisoned his waking hours. It was a fire that kept him warm, but it was also burning him from the inside out. He felt its corrosive effects in his snapped responses to Sarah, in his inability to be present with Lily, in the constant, acidic churning in his stomach. Daniel's words haunted him. The bitterness was a heavier chain than the poverty. Was this chain he was dragging really a mark of strength? Or was it, as the old man claimed, a self-imposed prison? He found himself arguing with a God he wasn't even sure existed. The silence of the forest was his only reply. Finally, tormented and exhausted, he drove back to the small community church. He found Pastor Michael tending to a small garden beside the chapel, pulling weeds from around a row of tomato plants. "Pastor," Ethan said, his voice raw. Michael looked up, wiping dirt from his hands onto his trousers. He saw the turmoil in Ethan's face and simply nodded toward a nearby bench. "Sit with me a while." "Ethan." They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the buzzing of bees and the distant caw of a crow. Ethan didn't know where to begin. He forgave him. Ethan finally burst out, the words tumbling out of him. The man who ruined him, betrayed him. My great-grandfather, he just let it go. Wrote it off as a loss and prayed for the man's soul. How is that not surrender? How is that not the ultimate weakness? Pastor Michael listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the distant green hills. He didn't quote scripture or offer theological dogma. Instead, he told a simple story. "When I was a young man," he began, his voice calm and steady, "my father owned a small hardware store in town. His business partner, a man he'd known since childhood, cooked the books for years, skimmed just enough that my father never noticed, until it was too late. We lost the store. We nearly lost our home. My father was a proud man, but he was broken by it. For years, every single day, he would talk about it. The betrayal, the injustice. He would rehearse the arguments he would have with the man if he ever saw him again. He kept that anger alive, tended to it like a fire." Michael paused, picking up a small, smooth stone from the ground and turning it over in his palm. One day, I asked him, "Dad, don't you ever get tired of being so angry?" And he looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. He was exhausted. He said, "Son, I'm carrying this man on my back every single day, and he doesn't even know it." Ethan felt a jolt, as if the pastor's words had struck a deeply hidden nerve. My father died a few years later. Michael continued softly. A bitter man. The anger never brought the store back. It never brought an apology. It just consumed him. It was a poison he drank every morning, hoping the other man would die. He looked directly at Ethan, his eyes full of a profound and gentle empathy. Forgiveness isn't about condoning what they did. Ethan, it's not for their sake. It's for yours. It's about putting down your own burden, so it doesn't crush you. Ethan sat with those words, the internal battle raging within him. The logic of it was undeniable, yet the emotional cost felt insurmountable. To forgive Marcus felt like letting a murderer walk free from the scene of the crime. But to continue carrying this hatred, the pastor was right. It was exhausting. It was a chain, heavier than any poverty he could imagine. The wrestling continued for 2 more days. Ethan barely ate. He barely slept. He walked the woods. He sat in the silent study, staring at the closed Bible. He was at an impasse. The path of his ancestor on one side, the fortress of his own pride on the other. On the 3rd night, he found himself on his knees on the cold wooden floor of the study, not knowing who or what he was praying to. He didn't ask for strength or for justice. He simply whispered into the darkness, "I don't know how. I can't do it." And in the deep silence that followed, a strange and terrifying resolve began to form. It wasn't a feeling of victory or divine intervention. It was a simple, stark realization. He could not go on like this. The path of bitterness led only to the same slow, spiritual death that had claimed Pastor Michael's father. There was only one other path offered. Terrifying as it was, he had to take it. With a hand that trembled slightly, he picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name Marcus Thorne. He hadn't spoken to him since the day the firm dissolved. He pressed the call button before he could lose his nerve. Marcus answered on the 2nd ring, his voice wary, defensive. "Ethan Marcus," Ethan said, his own voice surprisingly calm. "I need to see you. I'll come to Boston. We need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end. "What is this about?" Marcus asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "If it's about money, my lawyers have made the situation very clear. It's not about money." Ethan interrupted. "Just meet me." "Name the place?" Marcus, likely assuming Ethan was coming to beg, threaten, or grovel, finally agreed. The Copley Grind. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. A soulless, neutral coffee shop. A place for transactions, not reconciliations. "I'll be there," Ethan said, and hung up. He stood in the silent study, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a profound sense of fear, but underneath it, a quiet, unshakable sense of purpose. He was walking into the heart of his own pain, not to fight, but to surrender. The Copley Grind was exactly as Ethan had imagined, loud, impersonal, filled with the hiss of espresso machines and the clatter of ceramic on steel. It was a world away from the quiet woods of Havenwood. He spotted Marcus at a small table in the corner, looking impatient, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly living expenses. He looked older, his face etched with a tension that hadn't been there before. The cost of treachery, perhaps. Ethan walked over and sat down, a strange calm settling over him. Marcus didn't stand. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "All right, Ethan, you wanted to talk? Talk." His tone was clipped, arrogant, the armor of a guilty man. Ethan looked at the man, who had been his best friend, the best man at his wedding, the man who had systematically destroyed his life. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, envisioning a storm of righteous fury, of accusations and demands. But now, sitting here, he felt none of it. The hatred he had nursed for months was gone, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. It felt like pity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply met Marcus's gaze, his own eyes clear and steady. Marcus, what you did destroyed my career. It nearly destroyed my family. It took everything I had ever built. Ethan's voice was even, a statement of fact, not an accusation. I've carried that hatred for you every single day since. I've lived with it. I've slept with it. It's been like a poison, and I realized it was destroying me. Not you. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He opened his mouth to offer a defense, a justification. But Ethan continued, I didn't come here to ask for an apology. I didn't come here to talk about justice or money or the firm. I know I'll never get any of that from you. He took a breath, the words feeling momentous and terrifying as they formed. I'm here to tell you that I forgive you. The words hung in the air between them, more powerful than any shout could have been. Marcus stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He was completely and utterly stunned. This was not in his script. He had prepared for anger, for threats, for begging. He had no defense against this. Forgiveness was a language he did not speak. He was disarmed, his arrogance and defensiveness stripped away, leaving only a baffled, silent man. Ethan held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he stood up. He hadn't won. He hadn't lost. He had simply let go. He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Marcus sitting alone in stunned silence. As he stepped out onto the bustling Boston street, he didn't feel triumphant or righteous. He just felt light. The chain, the impossible weight he had been carrying for months, was gone. The drive back to Havenwood was a blur. Ethan felt strangely hollowed out, as if a core part of him, the anger, the bitterness, had been surgically removed. He had done the impossible thing, and the world had not changed. He hadn't received justice. He hadn't gotten an apology. Marcus would go on living his life, building his career on the ashes of Ethan's. By any rational measure, he had lost. He walked into the silent house and went straight to the study. He sat down in the old leather armchair, the room dark in the late afternoon twilight. And then it hit him. It wasn't a lightning strike or a chorus of angels. It was a wave, a profound, overwhelming, and utterly inexplicable sense of peace washed over him. It started in his chest and spread through his entire body, a warmth that unknotted muscles he didn't even know were tensed. The shame that had clung to him like a shroud, the rage that had been his constant companion, the grinding despair that had been the soundtrack to his life, it was all gone, utterly and completely gone. The sheer power of the relief was so intense that it brought him to his knees. He knelt on the dusty floorboards, his hands on the worn seat of the armchair, and wept. But for the first time in a year, they were not tears of anger or despair. They were tears of release, of catharsis, of a cleansing so deep it felt as if it were washing his very soul. He didn't understand it. It defied logic. It defied reason. He had given up his right to be angry, and in return, he had been given peace. Sarah, hearing the sound, appeared in the doorway. She saw him on the floor, his shoulders shaking, and her heart clenched with fear. But then he looked up at her, and she saw his face. The hardness was gone. The haunted, tormented look in his eyes had been replaced by a clarity she hadn't seen in years. Tears were streaming down his face, but he was smiling. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She walked into the room, knelt beside him, and wrapped her arms around him. He leaned into her embrace, the last of his defenses crumbling. She held him, her own tears now falling, tears of relief and gratitude. She understood, in that quiet, sacred moment, that the true collapse had not been the Elysian Tower, and the true restoration was not about buildings or bank accounts. The miracle he had been searching for wasn't a treasure hidden in a drawer. It had happened right here, in the dust of this old room. The broken soul was being made whole. Part 4, The Restored Life. A year passed. The sharp, painful edges of the past had softened, weathered by the slow, steady rhythm of life in Havenwood. The change was most visible in the old house itself. It no longer sagged with neglect. A fresh coat of deep blue paint covered the old, peeling siding. The porch was level and sturdy, its gingerbread trim meticulously repaired and painted a crisp white. The windows, once boarded up, were now clean and clear, catching the Vermont sun. Ethan had done the work himself, not with a crew of contractors, but with his own 2 hands. He had rediscovered the simple, grounding pleasure of labor, the feel of a saw cutting through pine, the scent of fresh paint, the satisfaction of driving a nail straight and true. Restoring the house had become a form of prayer, a physical manifestation of his own internal rebuilding. Each repaired shutter, each replaced pane of glass, was a testament to his new foundation. His relationship with Sarah had been restored along with the house, the space between them, once a chasm of resentment and misunderstanding, was now filled with a quiet, deep affection built on shared struggle and rediscovered respect. They talked, they laughed. They sat on the new porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies rise from the fields, their hands intertwined. Their love was no longer about shared ambition, but about shared life. Lily, now 8, was thriving. The spooky old house had become her kingdom, the woods her enchanted forest. She had shed the anxious confusion of their first few months and blossomed in the freedom of the countryside, her cheeks rosy with health and happiness. Ethan had not returned to the world of high-stakes architecture. The thought of it, of the ego and the pressure and the glass towers, held no appeal. He had started a small, one-man firm out of the restored study. He didn't design skyscrapers or corporate headquarters. He designed modest, practical, and beautiful homes for the people of Havenwood and the surrounding towns. He designed a new wing for the local library, a sunroom for an elderly couple, a sturdy, sensible barn for a young farmer. His work was no longer about building a legacy for himself. It was about serving the needs of a community. It was about creating spaces that nurtured life, not just inspired awe. He had found that his talent, once used to dominate a skyline, could bring a different kind of satisfaction when used to frame a family's view of a sunset. The financial wealth they had lost was never recovered. By the world's standards, they were poorer. They drove an old, reliable station wagon instead of a luxury sedan. Their clothes came from the general store, not designer boutiques, but sitting around their warm, noisy kitchen table, sharing a simple meal. Ethan knew with an unshakable certainty that they had never been richer. He had lost a kingdom of glass and steel and, in its place, found a home. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window of the restored study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was no longer a prison or a tomb. It was a sanctuary. The massive oak desk, once a symbol of failure, was now polished and cared for. Its surface smooth and warm to the touch. The books on the shelves were organized. The air smelled of lemon oil and old paper. It was a place of peace, a place of work, a place of gratitude. Ethan sat at the desk, Daniel David's heavy leather Bible open before him. Its pages were familiar to him now, as familiar as his own hand. He had read through his great-grandfather's notes dozens of times, tracing the journey from ruin to restoration, from bitterness to forgiveness, from despair to faith. It was a map that had guided him out of his own wilderness. He uncapped a simple, black fountain pen. The ink was dark and permanent. He turned the pages carefully to the book of Jeremiah, to a passage that Pastor Michael had shared with him one Sunday, a passage that had resonated deep within his restored soul. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. He found a small, empty space in the margin, just below a faded note from Daniel about trusting in providence. With a steady hand, in a script that was clear and deliberate, he added his own note to the legacy. My towers of glass turned to dust. I found my foundation on the rock of his word. The plans were not my own, and they were better. Ethan David, 2024. He capped the pen and gently closed the Bible. The story it contained was no longer just Daniel's. It was his, too. The legacy of faith, broken and forgotten for a generation, now continued. He looked out the window. In the green expanse of the backyard, Sarah was pushing Lily on a rope swing they had hung from the thick branch of an old oak tree. Lily's laughter, bright and clear, carried on the breeze. Sarah looked up toward the house and saw him in the window. She smiled, a radiant, unguarded smile of pure contentment. Ethan smiled back, his heart swelling with a profound and quiet joy. He had sought to build a legacy of steel that scraped the sky, a monument to his own ambition. But this, he realized, was his true legacy. This house, this family, this peace, this quiet, ordinary, miraculous life.